You know, it's hard to believe, but the 9/11 terror attacks happened nearly 18 years ago. And now, nearly 2 decades later, the number of victims actually continues to climb. More than 400 first responders were killed on that horrific day. But since then, nearly as many fire, police, and EMS people have died from exposure to the toxic fumes that they breathed during the aftermath of the towers falling. As if that isn't bad enough, the victims' compensation is being slashed as we speak. Our Dominic Carter is here, and he puts a human face on all of this. Dom?
Well, good evening to you, Richard. We just sat down with the children of first responders, a retired NYPD officer, and a lawyer who's fighting for the rights of all of them. The stories are just heartbreaking. The children of 9/11 first responders are now adults themselves.
So my father, he responded on 9/11 shortly after the collapse, and then he was diagnosed with bladder cancer in December of 2017. And then he passed away the following year in June. So 6 months from diagnosis to death.
Becoming ill all these years later, adding insult to a nearly impossible situation, those that are just getting diagnosed with cancer will not only get 50% less from the nearly financially broke Victims' Compensation Board, but now up to a 70% reduction on their claim.
My father had glioblastoma, which is a really aggressive brain cancer that someone would have 14 months or less to live.
Michael Barish is the lawyer.
Quite simply, we're running out of money. Nobody anticipated the explosion in cancers and deaths. Not a day goes by without one of my clients dying.
The government said the air was safe to breathe on 9/11, and in fact it was not. It's like cancer on steroids. So if it's beyond first responders, you see now residents and office workers now that are getting crazy amounts of cancer.
Robert will be following in his dad's footsteps, entering the fire department's academy in just 2 weeks.
You had kids that were exposed, that were infants, kindergartners, high schoolers, all exposed, all sent back to school saying it was fine. And now you have people our age and younger with breast cancer, prostate cancer, skin cancer, lung cancer, and I mean pancreatic cancer. It just doesn't end, you know.
I wanted to leave certain things to my family. I hope that I don't end up having to sell my house.
NYPD Lieutenant John Mercado worked for 24 years with emergency services and had just retired, but he refused to stay home that day. Mercado was diagnosed with stage 4 prostate cancer in 2014.
I immediately got in my car, went down to my old command, got in my uniform, and headed straight down towards the Trade Center. I was down there for the first month and a half. I never left the site. I actually slept in a little on a cot that I had in the back of the command post.
Mercado also spent years working with the New York Task Force #1 of FEMA. His pending Victims' Compensation Fund claim will likely be half of what was once offered to sick first responders and survivors.
15 years later, a lot of people started to develop these different, diseases and anomalies as a result of what had happened that particular day. There's a lot of money that's spent in this country, as we know, and it's wasted. And when you're not taking care of your veterans and you're not taking care of your first responders, that's a pretty sad state of affairs.
Along with the cancer, McOtter has suffered from numerous 9/11 related illnesses.
For some reason, we're having trouble getting Republicans who live outside of the New York area, who represent constituents outside of New York, to support the extension and the full funding that we need. And that's why we keep going to Washington. We're going to make this happen, but we've got to convince another 8 to 10 Republican senators to get on board. By the end of next month, Dominic, we will have lost more responders as a result of the toxic dust and the illnesses that it caused than we lost on 9/11. Think about that.
Dominic, I got a few questions. First off is we met Lieutenant McCardle in that piece. How's he doing now?
Frankly, Richard, not good. he's an American hero. What we didn't mention in the story is that not only was he a lieutenant in emergency services that had retired, and on 9/11/2001, himself decided to go down there, got his uniform, and spent the next month and a half staying down at the location. Okay, because he had retired just days before. So the reason why I say he's not doing so good, even though he's a proud man, and he's worrying about having to sell his home because of medical bills. He's given his life to NYPD. He's given his life to FEMA. He was a top official in FEMA from Task Force 1 out of New York. So he did the bombing in Oklahoma. He did the bombing at the Olympics in Atlanta. And so now, Richard, when he left us from the interview, he had to go to Mount Sinai Hospital for more treatment for his prostate cancer.
You know, we talk about the children of 9/11 who lost their parents in the towers. Well, now you have a whole nother group of children who lost their parents or seeing their parents in declining health who worked in the aftermath of those towers coming down. You profiled a bunch of one of which he's going to go into the FDNY now. It's like a cycle here, isn't this?
It is, Richard, and it's just interesting that young man, for all that he's lost, and the fact, remember, these young people, and it was hard for me doing these interviews to sit because you could feel their pain from just sitting across from them. They were fortunate enough to not lose their parents, in this case males, but you have male and female firefighters. They were fortunate enough to not lose their parents on 9/11. But some might say it was almost as bad, if not worse, that as they were in the 5th, 6th, and 7th grades, those young people we just spoke to, they watched their fathers, strong figures, firemen, policemen, first responders, they went from perfect health, strong individuals, to within months diagnosed with cancer and dead.
You know, as terrible as it was, just as a reminder, our government told these people the air was safe to breathe. The EPA said it's good. So these people weren't going against governmental orders. They went with governmental blessing to go be there day after day on the pile. And as bad as that was, you would think, okay, this is a tragedy. It happened to us, but we made mistakes and people got sick as a result. That said, that we have to go through this fight, and now the funding is being cut. Do the politics for a second of this, because again, people are realizing that somehow we're having this debate like every 3 years somehow, but it's really about 8 people.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the number of needed Republican senators to come on board. There's a senator or two that have joined the rest of the Democrats to say just make this funding permanent so they don't have to go out hat in hand. But right now, they don't have the votes.
Absolutely, Richard. You're 1,000% correct. If they could get the 8 to 10 Republican votes, it almost amounts to a mentality of us versus them, meaning Democrats in the Northeast or Northeast politicians versus the rest of the country. But
Well,
as
Democrats nationally have supported this. It's
Yes.
Republicans everywhere else. Yeah, I'm
right,
sorry. Yeah.
right. So Attorney Barish makes this point that what happened on 9/11, even though we didn't realize it, was that in the air, it amounted, with all the particles and so on, the toxins, it amounted to drinking Drano. That's how much was in the air, but no one knew it. And so these Republican senators have voted to reauthorize the compensation fund in the past, but now they're not coming on board. They've done the health element, but not the compensation element.
And if I could just remind people, Senator Cruz now, he resisted even giving funding to New York after the 9/11 attacks. And only after being shamed when he showed up here for a fundraiser did he and some others finally do it. But instead of making it permanent, they're making people, like we said, every so often, every few years, have to go there for the reauthorization for the funding. I think it's nothing short of a national disgrace. Hopefully, conscience and maybe politics will get them there. Dominic, great job. Thank you. Now, When we come back here, we're going to discuss new developments in the church abuse scandal. We're going to be joined by the head of SNAP. It's the largest survivor support group there is. There's big developments out of New York. We'll get into that and more with him straight ahead.